Hey guys, welcome back. Continuing a review of Battle for Zendikar Limited. We are getting into the multicolor cards. This is going to include the devoid cards that have a multicolor casting cost. My final video will be the actual colorless cards that do not require colored mana to cast. There are a lot of really cool multicolor cards, and I believe all of them are at least uncommon and above, so you're going to have to plan for them, but you're not going to see them as often as the commons. There are a lot of really cool ones, and I'm excited about the potential to build around a bunch of them. So let's jump in and see what we've got. First off, we start with Catacomb Sifter, which is a nice one. It's a 2/3 for 3. Enters the battlefield, gives you an Eldrazi sign, so you're getting essentially 3/4 for 3. And we have the additional ability that we've seen before. Whenever another creature you control dies, scry 1. So in this case, it's only when a creature you control dies. But if I've learned anything from these types of effects in the past, for instance, Shadows of the Past and Reaper of the Wild had similar effects, being able to scry on creatures dying is great. Obviously, it's only when your creatures die, so it's not quite Shadows of the Past, and it doesn't quite encourage your opponent. It doesn't quite dissuade your opponent from trading in the same way that Shadows of the Past would. But the upside is that there are a lot of sacrifice themes going on, and the Eldrazi Scions are often going to be sacrificed for mana. Every time you sack an Eldrazi Scion, if you control Catacomb Sifter, you get a scry off that. And these incidental scries off of creatures dying on your side of the field are very good. This card is solid. I would be very happy first picking it if there were nothing else better in the pack. Multicolor doesn't seem like it's going to be as hard to pull off as it would be in Origins, so I'd be a little more willing to start my draft off with a very solid multicolor card than I would in Origins. Moving on, we get Herald of Koza, another card that I think I would be super happy to have. This is a 3-mana 2/4 in Izzet colors. Colorless spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So this is incredible for this set. That means your devoid spells cost 1 less, and your solid colorless creatures and spells cost 1 less. Not to mention, this is already a 2/4 or 3, so it's going to be a little hard to just bump off the field. You should get a lot of value off this, and this should save you on the casting cost of at least the next 2 to 3 plays, if not more, once you cast this card. It's not so threatening that your opponent's probably going to want to blow a heavy removal spell on it, but it is has enough utility that it's going to benefit you in the long run, and the 4 toughness is very nice. Easily maybe not with these colors, but cheap for the effect that you get off of it. Essentially a ramp spell on its own, allowing you to play a 5-drop on the turn after you play Herald if you're playing on curve. Not to mention that it makes your colorless instants and sorceries cost 1 less as well. So cards like Horribly Awry and the devoid counter spells cost 1 less, making them that much better. Super cool card here. Not entirely sure what this art is all about, but I'm not going to complain. Forerunner of Slaughter is a 2-mana 3/2, which is ahead for this game. Obviously, it trades with 2 X's, but it has a little bit of upside here. So for 1 mana, target colorless creature gains haste until end of turn. So there's one way to think about this as a 3-drop with haste. If you spend the black, red, and then give it haste with your 3rd mana, you can start jamming in for 3 on turn 3. Alternatively, you can just play this down on turn 2 and then give your following creatures haste while also attacking with Forerunner. Forerunner is almost always going to demand some sort of blocker from your opponent, and even though it trades, it's going to eat something while also making your next colorless creature a threat. You could hold this and leave it back for a while because it blocks just as well as it attacks, at least for most of the 4-drops and below in this format, and the haste on colorless creatures is pretty useful in the long run. Ulamog's Nullifier is 4 mana in Dimir colors. This has Flash and Flying and is a 2/3. I would pay 4 for a 2/3 flyer. If we think about the Griffin in white, that is a 2/3 flyer for 4. This has an alternative ability where once it enters the battlefield, if you process 2 of your opponent's cards, you counter target spell. So it has a little bit of versatility. I'm not sure. This plays a lot like Silumgar's Sorcerer from Dragons of Tarkir. Excuse me, I had to sneeze there. In that sometimes you hold it up and your opponent doesn't actually cast something, or you really want to get the value off of it by countering something, but it's not always immediately available. If your opponent does not have 2 cards in exile and you don't have an immediate way to make that happen, I suggest just running this out. If you don't have anything better to play, so you can start at least attacking for 2 in the air. Or the flash lets you eat a blocker too. For instance, if your opponent's playing 2/2 flyers, the flash on this lets you kill that off while also getting a pretty long-term threat into play. This card is very versatile. Imagine the counter spell is only going to come up about half the time, and a lot of people are going to hold this in their hand until they can get that counter off of it, which is fine, but as an attacker this is already a fine card, and flash is one of my favorite abilities. The potential to blow out your opponent with flash cards is always great. So very exciting card here. The colors are a little odd, but as we've already seen in blue and black, ingest is a little more heavy in those colors, and there are evasive ways to exile your opponent's cards. So realistically, you can get this on turn 4 if you have the right kind of enabler to do it. Skywriter Elf. This guy seems pretty good as well. So we have an ally here and a converge card in one. It's a flyer, a 0/0 that enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter for each color mana spent to cast it. So this is basically Skyreach Manta from Modern Masters, or whatever set that was originally printed in, which had Sunburst, was a 0/0 flyer with the same exact ability. This one, however, you can pay 0 for X. You do have to pay at least green-blue, which is 2 different colors. So at its bare minimum, this is going to be a 2/2 flyer for 2, which is probably one of the best flyers in the set, one of the best 2-drops in the set. I think of the Ice Feather Aven from Khans of Tarkir, which was just fine as a 2/2 flyer for 2. That really gets in damage early. Obviously, you're going to want to hold this if you can, to get the most potential out of it. If you're getting 4 colors, you're getting a 4/4 flyer for 4. If you get 3, a 3/3 flyer for 3. All of those are amazing. At any point that you play this from 2 onwards, it's going to be an amazing drop, with the fullest potential being a 5/5 flyer for 5, which is going to be very hard for your opponent to deal with. Also comes down a lot earlier than most of the flyers that are going to be able to spar with it, so I can see this being a very early pick and a reason to go into the Converge deck. Resolute Blademaster, 5 mana, Boros colors, an ally as well. This one's a 2/2, so initially this creature is going to be a little bit weak, but whenever he enters the battlefield, or if another ally enters the battlefield, all of your creatures gain double strike. Now, I think this plays a little weird as an ally, because I'm less worried about this card itself as much as the other creatures I have on the battlefield when I already play it. I'm thinking of this guy as a win condition. Given my other creatures, double strike for 5 mana would be pretty good already, with the potential to repeat it over and over again. Just playing this guy by himself into an empty board is miserable, but playing it into a board full of creatures or a very widespread board and giving all of your guys double strike is a very deadly swing against your opponent. And if your opponent doesn't have a fog or a bunch of blockers, this guy can just win you the game the turn he comes down. So think of this as a sorcery that makes a 2/2 and has a repeatable effect, or think about it as an ally that fits into certain kind of decks. And I personally think that this guy is going to win a lot of games. Even though he dies quite easily, his effect is quite insane. Dragoness Emissary is another ally in black-white this time. A 2/2 flyer for 3 is fine, and at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses a life and you gain 1 life. So these kind of effects are always good in Two-Headed Giant. This effect is just fine in 1v1 as well, where you're getting incidental life swings by not having to attack. In the case of a board stall, this adds up over time, and this sort of a card is also good in multiples. Realistically, if your opponent is not able to block it with a flyer or a reach creature, you're swinging 3 damage on your opponent per turn, while also netting yourself 1 life gain per turn. I don't think this is as first pickable as some of the other uncommon multicolored cards we've seen, but it would be a happy addition to any deck that can support the colors. Grove Tender Druids is 4 mana ally as well. With Rally, whenever Grove Tender Druids or another ally enters, you can pay 1. If you do, put a 1/1 green plant token onto the battlefield. So we get a 3/3 for 4, which we've already seen quite a few of, so it spars well with creatures in the format. And it turns your allies into other creatures, basically. You get extra 1/1s for paying 1 extra mana. The payoff here isn't amazing, but the extra creatures can do quite a bit. Again, you want to be playing something like a Sacrifice Outlet, or you want a reason to have these 1/1s floating around. They do trade with Eldrazi Scion, which is nice, but they're probably going to sit back for a while until you have a reason to use them. If you're playing a bunch of mass pump spells, then I can see these plant tokens coming in very usefully, but I don't think this is the best ally in the world. I would be happy playing it if I could easily do green-white, but I wouldn't want to use one of these as my splash color. I don't think I would want to play green in a dedicated white deck just to play this card. Grove Rumbler, 4 mana 3/3 with trample. Landfall gives it +2/+2 for the turn. So this is exactly the card you want with the type of decks that can either bring in instant speed lands or put multiple lands onto the battlefield at the same time. I'm thinking of the rare that puts 3 lands from your deck onto the battlefield and gains 7 life. That's +6/+6 on this guy, making him a 9/9 trampler. Also, if you just consider your land for turn, in most cases this guy is going to be attacking as a 5/5 trampler for 4, which is way ahead of the game. It is an elemental as well, and as we'll see at the end of this video, that is a relevant typing in these colors. But I think this card is solid enough, even as a 3/3 for 4, that its upside is brutal against your opponent, and the trample is really what pushes it over the top here. Royal Spout, I really like cards like this. It's sorcery in Azorius colors. 3 mana to put a creature on top of its owner's library, and we have Awaken 4, 6 mana, white, blue, and 4 to make a 4/4. Now here, either mode is quite good. If we're playing a tempo game or we really need to get rid of something from our opponent's side of the field, we can bounce it back on top of its deck. And someone has mentioned in blue that this pairs very well with Ingest. If there's a creature you just can't deal with, put it back on their library, ingest it, and exile it, and it's gone forever. You won't have to worry about it. Now, I like when Awaken is a removal spell as well as a creature. The same as Sheer Drop. This plays very similar, getting rid of a creature off the field while making your own creature. And in this case, you get a 4/4 off of it. The 6 mana is very reasonable for these two effects together, and I feel like this is a very powerful uncommon. Moving on to the rares, our first one is Brood Butcher. This one is not insane, but it's still a very good value card. 5 mana, black-green for a 3/3, so the body's a little bit behind when we get to 5 mana, but it enters the battlefield and makes a Eldrazi Scion. So technically we're getting 4/4 for 5 mana, which is fine. The activated ability for black-green, you can sacrifice a creature and give target creature -2/-2. So you're often going to use this to pick off little guys. It is nice that Brood Butcher comes with his own sacrifice fodder to activate this ability at least once, and it is also worth noting that he can sacrifice himself to this ability. If something were to go wrong, you can use this ability in response and then get some value out of it. So over the span of a long game and multiple activations of this card, Brood Butcher can do quite a bit of work, but you do need to keep the sacrifice fodder coming. I'm thinking cards in green are going to be especially good as opposed to cards in black. This color combination supports both of those very well, with green supplying the fodder for black sacrifice outlets. Brood Butcher is a good combination of both of those colors and demonstrates how they play together quite well. Fathom Feeder, another blue-black card, this time a 2/2 for 1. This has Ingest and Death Touch. And for 5 mana, draw a card. Each opponent exiles the top card of his or her library. So first off, this guy can very easily get in damage because people are reluctant to block Death Touchers. Either he's getting in damage and you're fueling your ingest and getting cards into exile, or your opponent is trading something, usually something relevant. You're not going to attack this into Eldrazi Scion, obviously. Now, this is a more expensive Typhoid Rats in the worst case scenario, but that's fine because Typhoid Rats often just sits there making the board impossible to get through. This activated ability makes use of that, so if you draw this in the late game, or if you're stalling out and your opponent just doesn't want to attack into your Death Toucher, you have an activated ability to pull ahead, drawing a card for 5 mana and setting up your processors with the secondary ability here is quite good. I feel like the ingest on this is going to be useful only part of the time, and this is a rare, even though it feels like it might just be an uncommon. I think what really settles it for me is Death Touch, and with that addition, I'm willing to call it a good card. Moving on, Brutal Expulsion. I like cards like this that give me multiple effects off the same card. So we get a 4 mana, blue, red, and 2 devoid instant. We choose one or both, either return target spell or creature to its owner's hand, and or deal 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. In addition, if the permanent that is dealt damage goes to the graveyard, you exile it instead. So I like that this can be used basically as a remand without drawing a card, or a venser, if you will, returning a spell in the stack back to its opponent's hand. I like that if your opponent dumped a lot of Eldrazi Scion into a really expensive drop that they don't technically have the lands to play for, Brutal Expulsion sends that spell back to their hand, and now they don't have the mana to pay for it because they already got rid of all their Scion. They'll have to wait until they draw the actual land to do it again. Also, this can take out a little problematic guy or just a little Eldrazi Scion on the side. The 2 damage can't go to the face, so you don't necessarily get value off of it. In worst case scenario, this is just going to be bounce a creature to its owner's hand or deal 2 damage to a creature, which is not the best use of 4 mana, but the possibility to do these 2 together and clear off 2 things at once, or technically counter a spell and deal with a creature, are both very good. I think Brutal Expulsion is going to be one of my favorite playable cards. I compared to Winterflame here, and maybe the comparison's not really accurate because Winterflame was amazing in a morph format where a lot of things died to the 2 damage, but it demonstrates the same ability of dealing with 2 things at once in the same colors. In this case, bouncing a creature back to the hand instead of tapping it is preferable and justifies the 1 extra mana. Dust Stalker. 4 mana, red, black, 2. For a 5/3 with haste, if you do not control another colorless creature, it bounces during your end step, or during either player's end step. So if your opponent kills your other colorless creatures during their turn, this will bounce to your hand at their end step if this is the only colorless creature you control. Now, 5/3 with haste is quite good, can sneak in a lot of damage, and obviously you're not just going to jam with this if your opponent has an easy way to block it and is negligible. You really want to hold it until you know that you're going to sneak that 5 damage in. A lot of times you can just play this as a blocker if you have the other colorless creatures to support it. That way it's not bouncing to your hand. I feel like this is going to play very similarly to Sprint and Warbrute from Dragons of Tarkir, in that a lot of games will come down to whether or not you can smash in the 5 damage off your Dust Stalker, or if your opponent can deal with it in time. It is nice to know that the drawback is sometimes a benefit. For instance, your opponent cannot target this with sorcery speed removal if it returns to your hand. I think ideally though you want this to stick on the battlefield so you do not have to keep paying the mana to cast it and you can continue to build up your board. But the potential for this to just continue to sneak in 5 damage a turn is quite good and punishes your opponent for having weaker creatures or having a slow start. Veteran War Leader is a reason to be playing allies, even though you don't necessarily need allies for this card to be good. Veteran War Leader's power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control, and you have the ability to tap another ally and give War Leader either First Strike, Vigilance, or Trample, with First Strike and Trample probably being the more relevant things here. If you're going very wide and making lots of tokens, this guy can get quite out of hand, and his abilities make him a very threatening creature to have in combat. It shouldn't be too hard to grow this guy a little bit. And this is the type of card that your opponent brings in the weaker wrath effects against so that it dies. It plays very similar to the Scion. It's basically the same thing as Scion of the Wilds with the extra ability to gain First Strike and Trample and sometimes Vigilance. You don't necessarily need allies to take advantage of this, but if you have the allies coincidentally, it makes this card much better. I imagine this often being something like a 2/2 when you play it, and then growing bigger on the following turn, but in the right kind of decks, this creature can get huge in no time. Bring to Light is more of a constructed card. I'm not very excited to see it in my packs, and I don't think I would draft it very often. It is a converge spell that says, search your library for a creature, instant, or sorcery with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of colors spent to cast it. You then exile that card and shuffle your library, and you can cast the card you searched for immediately without paying its mana cost. I do believe you have to cast the card immediately, so you can't just wait until it's convenient to cast it. It is also worth noting that this does not grab enchantments or artifacts, only instant sorceries or creatures, and the maximum threshold is a 5-drop, so you can't use Bring to Light to go grab your big Eldrazi and then cast that for free. You can only grab a 5-drop and below. This is not a card that I want to go full on for unless I have something amazing to grab. For instance, if I first picked a Kiora or a Gideon, then I would be very happy to add this to the deck as another way to fetch them and cast it. It's essentially a second copy of your best 5-drop, but I think this is one of those converge spells where I'm not going to force extra colors or throw in just random splashes so that I can get the most off of this tutor effect. It is unique, but it's not necessarily at its best in limited. And having said that, I think I just remembered that I left Kiora off of this list of multicolor cards, so we'll be seeing it tacked on to the colorless cards in the next video. So sorry about that. I think I left it off at the end, but we'll see. Moving on, we get another red-white ally creature here. This one being a 3/4 for 4 is quite good, with haste as well, so the base stats and the haste ability are pretty good. Moonda, Ambush Leader, is a legendary creature with a rally. When it or another ally enters the battlefield, you look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal any number of allies, and put those on the top of your library in any order, and the rest on the bottom. So this definitely encourages you to play as many allies as possible. When he comes down, you are very likely to be able to see your next ally coming and set it up as your next draw. And when you play that one, you get to repeat the process. Hopefully, if your opponent's not interacting too much, you can just set up a stream of allies and continuing to trigger this plus the additional ally abilities. This card is more of an enabler for an ally deck, but its base stats are strong enough that I would play even if I wasn't running any other allies in my deck. March of the Tomb being another ally-based rare. This one in black and white for a total casting cost of 5 mana. Return any number of target ally creatures with total converted mana cost 8 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you have this card in your opening hand, or you're very likely to draw it, you can trade off your cheap allies quite well because you can use this to get them back. This will often get you probably about 2 allies, with the most often being 3, and anything above that just being absurd. In super aggressive low curve decks with lots of allies, you can push this to get as many as possible, but I think 2 to 3 is usually what you're going to see, with 2 being more likely than not. Some of the allies are very good, and some of them are bombs in their own respect, so having this available to get those bombs back if they die is a very good option. I don't know if I would first pick March of the Tomb, but if I had allies already by the time I opened this in another pack or saw somebody else pass to me, I would happily add it to my deck. And speaking of allies, we get a merfolk ally here, Noyan Dar, Royal Shaper. Dumb name, in my opinion. But we get another legendary creature. 5 mana 4/4 is fine. This one is in blue-white. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you may put 3/1/1 counters on target land you control. If you do, it becomes a 0/0 elemental with haste. That's still a land. So this basically is Awaken in the form of a triggered ability. It is optional, so you do not have to start turning all of your lands into creatures, but adding 3 power to the board with your extra lands every time you cast an instant or sorcery is amazing. Also, it's worth noting that you don't have to pay an activation cost anytime you cast an instant or sorcery. You just get to throw the counters on there and start attacking. This seems very good, and it seems like a very good way to turn lands you just played into useful creatures. I would be happy first picking this and kind of building around it, but at its very worst, it's a 5 mana 4/4, which would make my deck most of the time anyway. The upside here is very intriguing, and I'm excited to open this guy up and play with it. Angelic Captain, I think, has disappointed most people, but I think it's just fine of a card. Compared to our last red-white ally, I don't think it's quite as strong, but it is still a potentially hard hitter. This is a 5 mana 4/3 flyer, so if that were just the vanilla test there, this card passes and is definitely playable. Whenever Angelic Captain attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each other attacking ally. So again, like Veteran War Leader, this benefits more the more allies you have, but doesn't necessarily need more allies to be good. This can fit in any deck that plays red-white and is a pretty good top-end flyer. Like I said, the 3 toughness flyers are kind of at odds with each other in this format, but if you have the extra allies to push this guy above, you're going to win the game very quickly. Alright, and then we get into our mythics, both of which are absurd. I want you to just look at this card. This card is ridiculous. So just off of vanilla stats alone, Sire of Stagnation is a 6 mana 5/7. That's awesome. I would play that as a vanilla creature. Now this ability is just bonkers, and I'm starting to... Well, I keep double taking every time I see it because I'm pretty sure I'm misreading it. But it says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that player exiles the top 2 cards of his or her library, and you draw 2 cards. This does everything you want a 6 mana card to do. So people who are naysayers on this one, please leave, because this card is amazing in limited. The stats are good. It punishes your opponents for playing lands by allowing you to draw 2 cards every single time they play a land, which is crazy. Not only that, but it exiles the top 2 cards of your opponent's library. That sets up certain strategies with your processors, but it also makes sure that you drawing 2 cards isn't going to mill you before it mills your opponent. This is not necessarily the new Consecrated Sphinx, but the effect is similar in that you're benefiting from your opponent doing something that they're probably going to do naturally anyway. If you can ramp this guy out with Eldrazi Scion, then your opponent's not going to have much of a choice than to let you get value off of it. If you're getting it very late and your opponent can afford to stop playing lands, then it becomes less good, but it's still a huge attacker and a huge blocker all in one. My initial reaction is that your opponent could just play lands and try to draw you out of the game, by having you draw too many cards. But the fact that every time you draw 2 cards, your opponent also exiles 2 cards means that you're always at parity with how many cards are leaving each player's deck. Sire Stagnation is going any of my decks. If I'm solid mono green for the first 2 packs and I open Sire Stagnation, I am splashing blue and black for this card. And it does look like we left Kiora off, so our last mythic here is going to be Omnath, Locus of Rage, another quite insane one. This one being a 7-drop, and remember, 7-drops have to do something great and have to be reliable in order for them to justify a spot in your deck. 7 is a lot of mana. This one, however, I think makes up for its casting cost by its pure power. First off, we get a 5/5 elemental with a landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you get a 5/5 red and green elemental creature token. So if you play just 1 land after you play Omnath, you've added 10 power to the board. Omnath has essentially replaced himself if he dies. That is insane. Like, very good. 10 power for technically 8 mana is great. If you wait until you have your 8th land to use this effect, then you're going to get value off of it almost immediately. The secondary ability here, whenever Omnath, Locus of Rage, or another elemental you control dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to target creature or player. So if Omnath dies right away, at least you get 3 damage off of it, which puts your opponent at odds with trying to kill it. Every landfall trigger gives you an elemental, and if those elementals die while you control Omnath, bam, lightning bolt to the face or on your creature. Also worth noting, awoken lands in this format all become elementals. So if you have any awoken lands while Omnath's out and your opponent needs to find a way to deal with them, they're going to take damage for doing it. Omnath is everything you want in your 7-drop, a huge beater that adds tons of power to the board and also punishes your opponent for killing it. Omnath is going in my decks. It's a card you want to first pick and build around because its mana cost is quite restrictive, but it is one that definitely benefits from, definitely rewards you for playing it. I'm looking forward to seeing this guy in action. And I wish I had put Kiora here. I'm sorry I forgot about it. I'm getting my pictures from mythicspoiler.com, and I forgot that Kiora was listed at the top away from the rest of the multicolor cards, so that's my mistake, but we'll add it in on the next video as the first card, and that will be the last video. So again, I thank you all for watching. Let me know, especially let me know what your opinion of Sire Stagnation is. This might be the single most exciting card for me in the set, but almost all of these multicolor cards are exciting for me, and I'm ready to crack these packs and see what I can build. Alright guys, I'll be back for the last video. Thank you for staying tuned here, and let me know what you think.